we came to visit my husband's friend, and his back door was cracked open. And he wasn't answering his phone, so we came in the house, and he's in his basement.
Okay.
Oh my God.
Okay, calm down. Did you say he's dead?
I think so. Oh my God. I think so. He's on the floor. There's blood everywhere.
What is his name?
Oh, Brad McGarry.
Brad McGarry?
It was early evening on May 7th, 2017, in the quiet river town of Bel Air, Ohio, when a routine errand turned into a nightmare that would grip an entire county. David Kinney, his wife Sherry, and their young daughter pulled into the driveway of a modest home belonging to David's closest friend, Brad McGarry. They had one simple reason for stopping by, returning a weed trimmer Brad had lent them weeks earlier. But something felt wrong before they even reached the door. Brad's car sat parked in its usual spot, yet nobody answered their knock and no lights flickered behind the curtains. Sherry felt a small knot form in her stomach, the kind that tells you an ordinary moment is about to become something else entirely. David walked around to the side of the house, found the service door standing open and stepped inside, calling his friend's name. Only silence answered him. Sherry went upstairs to check the bedrooms while David moved toward the basement stairs, his voice growing more urgent with every step he took down into the dark. The air in the house felt heavier the further inside they went. That particular kind of quiet that settles in when something has gone terribly wrong and every instinct in your body already knows it before your mind catches up. What David found waiting for him down there would end one man's life, unravel a family, and expose a secret that had been buried for years behind birthday parties, holidays, and easy laughter. This is the story of Brad McGarry, the man almost everyone in his life adored, and the best friend who quietly became his killer. Before we get into it, if you love cases where nothing turns out to be quite what it seems, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss one of these stories. Now, back to Bel Air. To understand how this tragedy came together, we have to rewind almost a decade, back to a coal mining safety class in 2011. David Kinney was only 20 years old at the time, freshly married, still finding his footing as a new husband and stepfather. Sherry already had children from a previous relationship, and a few people in David's circle had quietly questioned whether he was ready to take on that kind of responsibility so young. David brushed off the doubts. He loved Sherry, he loved her kids, and he was determined to build a stable life for all of them, which meant finding steady, well-paying work, even if that work happened underground, in the dark, hundreds of feet below the hills of eastern Ohio. It was in that training class that David met Brad McGarry, a man about a decade older who already carried a reputation as one of the most easygoing, likable people in any room he walked into. Brad had grown up in a small, conservative pocket of the state, and he had never hidden who he was, even when that honesty cost him. People who knew him as a teenager remembered him being mocked, called names, and pushed to the margins for being openly gay in a place that did not always make room for that kind of openness. Brad refused to shrink himself to make anyone else comfortable. He carried himself with a warmth and humor that, over time, won over the very communities that had once been cruel to him. Those who grew up alongside him describe a kid who simply refused to disappear. He did not tone himself down at school, did not pretend to be someone he was not just to avoid a fight, and somehow, against every expectation, that stubborn honesty eventually became his greatest strength as an adult. By the time he reached his 30s, Brad was the person people called when they needed to laugh, the one who remembered everyone's birthday, the one who could turn a slow afternoon at the salon into the best part of someone's week. For years, Brad worked as a hairdresser, a job he genuinely loved, but one that never quite paid the bills the way a growing family and a mortgage demanded. Eventually, he made the leap into coal mining, trading scissors and a salon chair for a hard hat and a headlamp, determined to prove that a gay man from a small town could do the same grueling, physical, dangerous work as anyone else, and do it well. It was a gamble that paid off, both financially and personally, because it was in that new career that he found David. The two men became inseparable almost immediately. Brad had an easy way of making people feel like family within minutes of meeting them, and it was not long before he was exactly that to the Kinneys. He spent holidays at their table, took vacations with them, and became so close to David's children that they simply called him Uncle Brad. No explanation needed. There was even talk of a family trip to the Bahamas planned for that coming August. Tickets half discussed, a getaway everyone was looking forward to. From the outside, looking in through any window on any given Sunday, it looked like exactly the kind of friendship people spend a lifetime hoping to find. What none of them knew, not Sherry, not the children, not the co-workers or cousins or friends who watched Brad and David laugh together at every gathering, was that somewhere along the way their bond had quietly become something more complicated. For years, hidden beneath the barbecues and birthday parties and inside jokes, David and Brad had been carrying on a secret relationship, one David was terrified anyone would ever discover, because discovery meant losing everything he had built his public life around. David and Sherry's own story had started years earlier at a family celebration thrown in David's honor, the kind of gathering where relatives pack a backyard with folding chairs and someone always brings too much potato salad. Sherry showed up that day with her sons in tow, and by all accounts, David could not stop looking her way. The two talked for hours, and the next morning David told his own mother, without a trace of doubt in his voice, that he had just met the woman he wanted to spend his life with. Not everyone around him was convinced it was wise, taking on a ready-made family so young, but David never treated it like a burden. He treated it like the beginning of everything he wanted, and for years, on the surface at least, that is exactly what it looked like. By the spring of 2017, David was 30 years old, still married to Cherie, still presenting the picture of a devoted husband and father to everyone who knew him at church, at work, and around the neighborhood. Brad, meanwhile, was juggling long shifts at the mine, his role as the family's favorite honorary uncle, and a private relationship that had grown harder and harder to keep contained inside its old boundaries. On the afternoon of May 7th, Brad left a family lunch early, telling relatives he needed to get back home because someone was coming to see him. He mentioned the visitor only by a nickname, DJ, and joked that he might be taking a nap with his guest that afternoon, a comment that carried far more weight than any of them realized in the moment. Hours later came the discovery in the basement, Brad's body lying face down in a spreading dark pool of blood on the concrete floor. Sherry rushed downstairs at the sound of her husband's scream and was met with a scene neither of them would ever be able to unsee for the rest of their lives. She called 911 immediately, hands shaking, and within minutes the quiet street outside Brad's house filled with flashing lights, radio static, and neighbors stepping out onto their porches to see what was happening. The first officers on scene moved through the house with the practiced caution of people who had seen tragedy before, but still felt the weight of this one settle differently. Deputies secured the perimeter, radioed for backup, and gently guided Cherie and her daughter out to a patrol car while David waited nearby, pale and unsteady, replaying the image from the basement over and over in his mind. Body cameras rolling on the officers' chests captured every unguarded second of it, footage that would later be picked apart, frame by frame, in ways none of them could have predicted that evening. When officers arrived, they found David and Cherie visibly shaken, grieving, describing Brad as practically a member of their own family. They explained the closeness of the relationship, the holidays, the vacations, the nickname Uncle Brad, painting a picture of a devastating, senseless loss for a family that had simply come by to return a borrowed tool on their way home. Investigators had no reason yet to doubt a word of it. On the surface, this looked like a family in shock, not a family hiding anything. Inside, detectives began working the scene methodically, room by room. Brad lay on the basement floor, shot in the head, a heavy pool of blood beneath him. At first, with no weapon anywhere in sight, some officers wondered aloud whether this could be a suicide, a quiet tragedy rather than a violent crime. But when the forensic examiner turned the body over to check underneath, as is standard procedure in cases where a person may have taken their own life, there was no gun anywhere near him, not under his body, not within reach of his hands. That theory collapsed almost as quickly as it had been raised. Attention shifted upstairs, where the house told a strange, contradictory story. Drawers had been pulled open in the kitchen, papers and belongings scattered across the living room floor, everything staged to look like the chaotic aftermath of a robbery gone wrong. Yet the closer detectives looked, the less the pieces fit together. Brad was known among friends as a serious collector of rustic, country-style art, and his home was full of valuable pieces, none of which had been touched or removed. Cash sat out in plain view on a countertop. The television, an easy grab for any real burglar in a hurry, remained untouched on its stand. Whoever had ransacked this house had not actually been searching for anything to steal. They had been trying to convince the police that they had. With robbery quietly ruled out, investigators turned to a harder, more uncomfortable question: whether Brad's murder might have been motivated by hatred toward who he was. As an openly gay man working in a coal mine, an industry and culture not always known for tolerance, it seemed at least plausible that a co-worker had taken issue with him, that the same prejudice he had faced as a teenager had simply followed him underground. Detectives approached this angle carefully, aware of how often exactly this kind of crime goes unanswered in small, tight-knit communities. But when they sat down with the men who worked alongside Brad every single day underground, the answers came back unanimous. He was respected, he was well-liked, and nobody at that mine had a single bad word to say about him. One former colleague, now a detective himself, told investigators plainly that Brad had no enemies at work, that if anything, he had earned a kind of quiet respect for simply refusing to hide. There had been friction once, early on, when he first transferred to a new site, but nothing that had followed him into 2017, and certainly nothing that pointed toward murder. That theory, too, was carefully set aside. One detective would later put it simply, that in cases like this, 9 times out of 10, whoever took a victim's life had also, at some point, loved that same person. It was a grim rule of thumb, but one that pointed the investigation away from strangers and co-workers and back toward the small, tight circle of people who actually knew Brad best. Digging further into Brad's personal life, detectives learned about a man named Scotty, an ex-boyfriend Brad had recently split from after a relationship friends described as volatile, exhausting, and increasingly strange in its final months. Brad's friend Wendy told police she had never liked the relationship, and that things between Brad and Scotty had grown tense and unpredictable before it finally ended. It seemed for a moment like a promising lead, until detectives tracked Scotty down and discovered he had been sitting behind bars on a probation violation for months, an alibi that could not be argued with, no matter how the timeline was stretched. Even so, investigators did not fully cross him off their list right away, wondering briefly whether he could have orchestrated something from behind those walls. A visit to the jail and a raw, genuinely stunned reaction to the news of Brad's death was enough to convince them that Scotty had nothing to do with what happened in that basement. Meanwhile, a separate team of investigators had spent hours canvassing the neighborhood, hoping someone nearby had a camera pointed toward the street. It felt like a long shot, the kind of lead that rarely pans out in a rural county with houses spaced far apart. Then a neighbor mentioned a small security camera mounted above their own front door, one that happened to face the road running past Brad's house. Detectives sat down with hours of footage, watching cars pass frame by frame, trying to spot anything unusual on a day that had otherwise looked completely ordinary. It was slow, tedious work, the kind that rarely makes it into the highlight reel of an investigation, but it would soon prove to be one of the most important pieces of the entire case. 2 days into the investigation, the case was stalling badly, the leads running dry one after another until a conversation with one of Brad's cousins cracked it wide open. She told detectives that Brad had left a family gathering early that day because a man he referred to only as DJ was coming over, and that Brad had made a joking, knowing comment about the two of them napping together that afternoon, a clear hint at something romantic between them. She went further, revealing that Brad had confided in her quietly that DJ was a married man who had never come out to his own wife, and that the two of them had been involved for years, carefully, secretly, patiently. Pressed by investigators for a real name, she finally gave one, and the room went completely still. DJ was David. The same David who had discovered the body in the basement. The same David who had sat with officers just days earlier, describing Brad as practically a brother to him, tears in his eyes, voice cracking on camera. In an instant, the entire case turned on its head, and every earlier assumption had to be thrown out and rebuilt from scratch. What had looked like a grieving witness now looked like something far more troubling and far more calculated. Detectives, careful not to tip their hand too early, asked David to hand over his phone under the pretense of pulling photos related to the crime scene. What they were really after was his location data for the hours surrounding the murder, and it placed him squarely at Brad's house at the exact time Brad was killed. Deleted messages, recovered through deeper forensic work, confirmed a sexual relationship stretching back years, not months. Surveillance footage from a neighbor's camera down the street sealed it further, showing David arriving that afternoon in his wife's car, of all vehicles, staying roughly 40 minutes, then returning hours later in his own truck with Sherry and their daughter, under the same rehearsed cover story about the weed trimmer that had brought them there in the first place. Confronted with all of it laid out on the table in front of him, David admitted he had been at the house, but his story shifted again and again over the course of a long, grinding interrogation, at one point involving a mysterious third man who supposedly appeared out of nowhere, argued with Brad, shot him, and then threatened David into silence before letting him walk free. Detectives did not believe a word of it, and eventually David's account changed course entirely. He confessed to the affair, though he insisted it had only been going on a few months rather than years, and claimed Brad had grown angry and desperate that afternoon when David tried once and for all to end things between them. According to David, Brad pulled a gun during the argument. The two of them struggled over it. David wrestled it free, and he shot his friend once in self-defense before firing a second shot as Brad lay helpless on the ground. Investigators noted that over the course of that single interrogation, David's version of events changed shape 7 or 8 different times, each new telling shedding one more inconvenient detail while adding one more excuse. First, he was simply a friend delivering a weed trimmer. Then he was a witness who had stumbled onto a stranger's crime. Then he was a man defending himself against a friend he had never once described in any earlier conversation as anything more than family. Detectives later said that watching those stories collapse into each other, one after another, was like watching a man try to build a wall faster than the tide could knock it down. It was a story that fell apart under basic physics the moment the medical examiner's report came back. The autopsy showed Brad had been shot twice in the back of the head, a wound pattern that made a face-to-face struggle, the kind David described almost physically impossible. When asked about the missing weapon, David claimed he had thrown it away somewhere while fleeing the scene, and despite an extensive search of the surrounding roads and fields in the days that followed, it was never recovered. Before David was formally taken into custody, investigators allowed him one last conversation with his wife, quietly observed from another room. Through the glass, Cherie listened as David admitted to the affair and told her he wished more than anything that he could undo everything that had happened. She could barely speak. When she finally did, she asked him, through tears, whether he understood what he had just told her, and said she could not even bring herself to look at him anymore. It was painfully clear to everyone watching that Cherie had known absolutely nothing about the second life her husband had been quietly living behind her back for years. On May 9th, David was formally arrested and charged with murder. Investigators believed Brad, exhausted from hiding and increasingly pushing David to finally leave Cherie and build an open life together, had threatened to reveal the truth himself, giving David a motive to silence him permanently and protect the comfortable life he had built on a foundation of lies. At a preliminary hearing held soon after, prosecutors laid out the growing list of inconsistencies in David's shifting account, while officers described how visibly ill and distressed he had appeared at the scene that day, struggling to breathe, unable to keep from being sick. A judge found probable cause to move the case forward and set bail at $1 million, later denying a request to lower it, even after friends and family took the stand and testified to David's character as what they believed was a devoted husband and father. In the weeks leading up to trial, David's defense attorney filed a long list of motions, more than a dozen in total, hoping to chip away at the prosecution's case before it ever reached a jury. Among those motions was another request to lower David's bail, this time to a figure his family said they could actually manage. Relatives packed the courtroom that day, and several took the stand, including Cherie, David's mother, and other family members, all describing him as hardworking, responsible, and devoted to his children. Cherie herself testified about the 10 years David had spent raising her children as his own, providing for them financially and emotionally, even though he had never been their biological father. Under cross-examination, she was asked directly whether David had acted strangely on the day they found Brad, and she said no. Nothing about that afternoon had seemed unusual to her at the time, which only made the truth that emerged later that much harder to process. The judge ultimately denied the reduction, pointing out that David had knowingly brought his own wife and young daughter into a house where a dead body was waiting, all while pretending he had no idea what they were about to find. The trial itself stretched across roughly a week, filled with surveillance footage, cell phone records, and body camera video that undercut David's account at nearly every turn, one contradiction after another. One of the more striking moments came from forensic testimony about DNA evidence recovered at the scene, testimony that complicated a few small details of the prosecution's theory, but did nothing to change the brutal, physical facts of how Brad actually died. Friends of Brad's also took the stand, several of them fighting through tears as they described the man they had lost. A co-worker who greeted everyone by name, a cousin who never missed a family gathering, a friend who once drove 2 hours in the middle of the night just to help someone move. Those small human details, the kind that rarely make it into a police report, filled the gaps that the physical evidence could not, reminding the jury that the man in the autopsy photos had also been someone who made an entire community feel a little brighter simply by showing up. The defense argued David had panicked in the moment and acted only to protect himself, admitting that he had lied repeatedly but insisting that lying alone did not make a man a murderer. Prosecutors countered simply and repeatedly, reminding the jury that 2 shots to the back of a kneeling man's head, delivered execution style, were never the actions of someone genuinely defending his own life. After deliberating for several hours behind closed doors, the jury returned a unanimous verdict, guilty of aggravated murder. The courtroom fell into a heavy, stunned silence before gasps and quiet sobs broke out from Brad's family and friends seated in the gallery. Given the chance to speak before sentencing, David apologized to Brad's family, saying he never intended for any of this to happen and wished more than anything that he could take it all back. The judge was unmoved by the apology, describing the killing as a calculated, cold act followed by a deliberate cover-up, noting that David had lured Brad in with intimacy and trust only to end his life and then spend every hour afterward trying to hide what he had done, even at the cost of dragging his own wife and daughter into the same house where the body still lay. The judge had several sentencing options available to him, all carrying life in prison, but differing in whether David might one day become eligible for parole after 20, 25, or 30 years behind bars. David's defense attorney pushed for the most lenient of those options, reminding the court that his client had no prior criminal record and had otherwise lived as a law-abiding citizen right up until that afternoon in the basement. The prosecutor pushed back just as hard, arguing that Brad would never get another birthday, another holiday, another ordinary Tuesday, and that his family would carry that absence for the rest of their lives. So the sentence handed down should reflect the permanence of what had been taken from them. The judge agreed, stating plainly that a man capable of killing someone who loved him, someone who had never once threatened him with anything but the truth, could not be trusted with the freedom to walk back out into public life. In February 2018, David Kinney was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, with additional time added on top for using a firearm during the commission of the crime. Investigators later reflected that the entire tragedy might never have happened at all if David had simply found the courage to be honest about who he was, rather than protecting a secret at the cost of the one friend who had never judged him for it. His appeals in the years since have all been denied, one after another, and as of the most recent records available, he remains incarcerated in Ohio, still serving out that sentence today. Brad McGarry never got the chance to live openly and fully with someone who loved him the way he deserved to be loved. He got a nickname, Uncle Brad, a family who genuinely adored him, holidays spent at their table, a vacation that never happened, and a friend who ultimately decided that Brad's silence was worth less than his own comfortable lie. Friends who knew him still describe him the same way today, larger than life, endlessly kind, the one who could walk into any room and make people feel at home, no matter who they were or where they came from. Detectives who worked the case for months afterward have said it stayed with them longer than most, not because of the violence itself, which they had unfortunately seen before, but because of how ordinary everything looked right up until the moment it was not. A loving family, a beloved friend, a quiet town where everyone assumed they already knew each other's whole story. It is a reminder that stayed with the investigators long after the courtroom doors closed, that the people we trust most completely are sometimes the very ones carrying the heaviest secrets, and that those secrets, left buried long enough, can eventually cost someone everything. For Sherry, the aftermath brought its own quiet devastation, one that unfolded far from the cameras and courtrooms. She lost a husband to a prison sentence and lost a friend to a grave on the same terrible day, and she had to explain to her children, in some form they could understand, why Uncle Brad was gone and why their father was never coming home either. Neighbors in Bel Air still talk about how close-knit that family once seemed, how normal it all looked from the porch next door, and how impossible it was to imagine any of it hiding something so painful underneath. What makes this case linger long after the verdict and the sentencing hearing faded from the local headlines is not just the violence of it, but the quiet, ordinary years that came before it. A friendship that looked, from every outside angle, like exactly what it was supposed to be. A family that truly believed they knew the man sitting across from them at every holiday dinner. And a secret that grew so heavy over so many years that one man decided the only way to carry it any further was to make sure the other person carrying it with him could never speak again. That is the story of Bel Air, Ohio, and the secret that ultimately cost a good man his life. Thanks for watching. If cases like this one keep you thinking long after the video ends, subscribe, hit that bell, and we will see you in the next story.